Sitting in jail gives you a lot of time to reflect on your own foolishness. However, I wasn't reflecting on anything except anger. I was focused on the anger I had for my boss, my soon-to-be ex-wife Carol, and the anger towards myself for being so stupid. My name is Michael Arnold, and when I say I was stupid, I mean stupid with a capital S. I was stupid as in the clueless husband who didn't know that his wife was betraying him. And she was betraying him with the man I hated most in my life, my boss, Jacob Sanders. I was also stupid because I didn't know that the unfaithful person was pregnant with his child. Stupid me thought the baby was mine. I guess my wife being pregnant is what sparked the honey we need to talk conversation. I suppose I should back up a bit and do a little explaining. Strange as it may seem, my current problems actually started in the first grade. I first came to know and eventually despise Jacob Sanders when we both entered the first grade together. We have been enemies since he made fun of my freckles. That was the first of many arguments. That one ended in a draw as a teacher dragged us apart. I had a bloody nose, and he had a black eye. Over the first 8 years of school, Jacob and I averaged about 3 arguments a year, with the third grade being the worst. We had 7 arguments. However, in the 8th grade, we only had one for a good reason. I defeated him. I didn't want anything to do with Jacob, and I tried to stay away from him, but he wouldn't leave me alone. For some reason, he was jealous of me and was constantly trying to outdo me. He tried to get better grades than me in each of our classes. He was better at science and literature. I was better at math and history. The rest of the subjects we were about the same. In sports, Jacob was a pretty good athlete, but I was a little better. Nevertheless, if I joined a sport, Jacob joined the same one and tried to outdo me. The argument stopped, as I mentioned, after 8th grade when Jacob realized that he couldn't beat me. Then he started trying to embarrass me or get me in trouble. He almost got me expelled and perhaps even arrested while we were in high school. It was in our sophomore year when someone broke into the school and vandalized the hallways. The authorities found my student ID next to an empty spray can in the dumpster. The only thing that saved me was the fact that I'd noticed my ID was missing out of my wallet the day before and reported it. I knew it had to be Jacob because I had seen him walking away from my locker after practice one day when I came out of the shower. I figured he was up to no good, so I checked everything in the locker. When I got to my wallet, I checked my cash first and then went through the rest of it. That's when I noticed my ID was gone. I went immediately to the front office and reported it. One time, Jacob had a noisemaker. He had put the device in the desk I was sitting at and triggered it. The noise blasted through the class, and then Jacob began holding his nose and waving his hand. "Mike, what did you have for lunch?" he chortled. The class laughed, but I used the old standby. He who smelt it dealt it. The class exploded with renewed laughter, which brought a warning from Miss Wormwood that if Jacob and I continued to disrupt the class, we'd be spending time in detention. Being laughed at and then scolded by our teacher angered Jacob. He turned bright red but said nothing. Besides attempting to get me expelled and perhaps even arrested, Jacob's efforts were more annoying than anything. For the most part, I didn't care if he was better than me in most things. Outside of the normal teenage insecurities, I was pretty comfortable with who I was. However, there was one area that I did care about, and that was girls. Both of us were reasonably good-looking. However, Jacob's family was wealthy, which gave him the advantage with the girls in school. He had his own car in the 11th grade, and it wasn't an old clunker. His parents bought him a fancy sports car, which was a very expensive car. How could I compete with that? As it turned out, I was good-looking enough to get my fair share of dates. On the other hand, Jacob was dating the popular girls in school. I figured they were out of my league anyway, so I didn't care. However, he wasn't satisfied with his success with the girls. He had to try to make me feel inferior. If I dated a girl more than once, Jacob would swoop in and start dating that girl. And it didn't take long for her to drop me. Even there, for the most part, I didn't care. I wasn't in a serious relationship with any of the girls, so if they wanted to date Jacob, it was no problem. Yet, there was one girl that I really did like. Her name was Sandy Springer, and she was intelligent, funny, and pretty. So when I started dating her, I took her to less popular places so that Jacob wouldn't know that I was interested. After a couple of months of dating, we decided to be exclusive. I thought if Sandy was wearing my class ring, I was safe. Remember when I mentioned that I was stupid? I was stupid all the way back then too. With the senior prom coming up, I just assumed that Sandy and I would be going together. I should have asked her right away, but I'm not sure that would have mattered. Anyway, after I bought the tickets, I mentioned it to Sandy at lunch. She got red and said that she had accepted an invitation from Jacob to go with him. I demanded and got my ring back. Then I left Sandy sobbing in the cafeteria. I never spoke to her again. I was so angry at Sandy that I was looking to vent my anger. Instead, I saw Pam Taylor, the captain of the cheerleader squad and Jacob's supposed girlfriend. Under normal circumstances, I would never have dared approach her. "Hey Pam," I said cheerfully, "how are you doing?" "I'm doing good. How about you, Michael?" she responded. Pam was beautiful, but she wasn't stuck up. "I'm doing okay," I said, figuring that I had nothing to lose. "Say, would you like to go to the prom with me?" "That's very sweet of you to ask," she said kindly, "but I'm going with Jacob." Oh, I feigned ignorance. I must have misunderstood because I just heard that Jacob asked Sandy Springer. I must have got it wrong. Yeah, forget I said anything. I'm sure I heard it wrong. I left Pam flustered and talking to herself. I heard later that she and Jacob had a huge argument. Maybe he had stolen Sandy from me, but I had messed up his plans with Pam. It wasn't totally satisfying, but it was better than nothing. But later that afternoon, it got a whole lot better. Michael Pam called to me as I was leaving school. "Hey Pam," I continued playing innocent. "I'm sorry about upsetting you earlier." Cut the nonsense. Michael Pam's eyes narrowed. "I found out that you were in a relationship with Sandy, and that jerk, Jacob, stole your girlfriend." My ears burned red. I had been caught. "Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just trying to get back at Jacob. I'm sorry you got caught in the middle. Were you serious about taking me to the prom?" "Do bears," I started to say. "Never mind. Yes, I would be thrilled if I could escort you to the prom." "Good, because I want revenge," Pam said. "And if you play your cards right, it could be a very memorable night." The prom turned out to be a true highlight for me. Not only did I get to take the most attractive girl in school to the prom, but she made me feel like a prince. Pam was all over me. I enjoyed the surprise on the other guys' faces. They couldn't believe that she was there with me. And Jacob, I don't know what he thought was going to happen, but it definitely wasn't having his girlfriend out on a date with me. His eyes almost popped out of his head when he saw us come into the gym. Throughout the night, he tried to come between Pam and me. He tried to get her to leave me and sit at his table. Pam shut him down. He asked her to dance numerous times, but Pam wouldn't give him the time of day. I really felt sorry for Sandy because she realized that Jacob had used her. Sandy finally broke down crying and had her parents pick her up. I still feel a little bad about that even now, but she made her choice and had to live with it. After the prom, Jacob still tried to take Pam away from me. I was smart enough to know that I was playing the part of Cinderella, and by tomorrow, Pam would probably be back with Jacob. But for tonight, I was going to play my part as far as it would go. When I dropped Pam off, she hugged me and told me what a great guy I was. I went home feeling ecstatic. But as I expected, by the following Monday, Pam and Jacob were a couple again. Still, I would smirk at Jacob whenever we passed in the hall. Graduation came and most of us went off to different colleges. I was sad to be leaving my hometown and scared about the unknown, but I wasn't sorry to be parting ways with Jacob forever, or at least I thought so. I had been accepted at Georgia Tech while Jacob was going to Harvard. Of course he was going to Harvard. His grandfather had a building named after him there. I did well at Georgia Tech, majoring in software design. And it was at a mixer during my junior year at Tech that I met Carol. I'm not going to bore you with the details of how we got to know each other, became close, and got married. Well, in truth, I think at the beginning we were more really good friends than truly in love. Needless to say, our story wasn't that memorable, and it's all irrelevant now anyway. I will say this about Carol: she was smart. She was a business major at the University of Georgia. I liked her because she was not only smart, she was also funny and very friendly. However, Carol wasn't super attractive. She was pretty in the girl next door kind of look. In truth, Carol couldn't hold a candle to Pam, but she was about as pretty as Sandy. For whatever reason, we connected. We got married 3 months after we graduated, and for our 5 years of marriage, I thought we were pretty happy. Even though we were more friends than romantic partners when we got married, by the 3rd year of our union, I was completely devoted to Carol, and I believe she was equally in love with me. We were even talking about starting a family. Little did I know that my wife had kind of jumped the gun on that and started one without me. Straight out of school, I got a job with Zaba Security Software, a small startup company. I had graduated at the top of my class, so I had my choice of jobs. The 2 brothers at Zaba sold me a bill of goods about being in a great position and making a fortune. However, Don't get me wrong, the company did very well. The firm prospered, and we turned out high-quality work for some very large companies. I was also paid a good salary. Our job was to find weaknesses in the company's software security and fix them. Our reputation was growing, but then the brothers decided to sell the company. Surprisingly to me, we were acquired by a firm roughly the same size as Zaba, and that's when my problems began. About 3 years after I started working for Zaba, Carol wanted to find a new job. As luck would have it, Zaba was looking for an office manager. So Carol applied and was hired. I was a little concerned about both of us working for the same company, but it turned out fine at first. We used to carpool and have lunch together. We were in completely different departments, so we rarely saw each other during the day. We drove to work together, gave each other a hug, and went to our departments. If we were both free, which was most days, we ate lunch together and then drove home together at the end of the day. It worked well for us until everything went downhill. Before I tell you about the acquisition, let me tell you about my department. I was the senior programmer, which meant that I worked on projects myself and oversaw the work schedule for the other 8 programmers that reported to me. But my main responsibility was to troubleshoot any problems that my team couldn't handle on their own. Fortunately, those were few, which meant our customers were very satisfied. Our workspace was about the size of half a basketball court. We called it the bullpen, and we worked mostly at stand-up desks. The room was filled with all kinds of computers, servers, interfaces, and printers. We had just about all the computer hardware you could ever want. We took pride in making our customer systems as secure as possible. In the 5 years I've worked for the company, we've only had one complaint where a customer system was hacked. But we traced the hack back to one of the company's employees. He had disabled much of the software we had installed. The employee wasn't very clever, but he did cause us a sleepless night. In addition to the 9 of us, we had an administrative assistant, Kimberly. She was like our right-hand person. She prepared any correspondence or memos we needed. She kept track of our supplies and made sure we never ran out of anything. Kimberly also prepared our monthly reports and kept track of our billing hours. Strange as it may seem, much of our work was done, initially, with pencil and paper. This gave the programmer an overview before they started entering anything into the computer. Somehow, Kimberly was able to decipher everyone's handwriting and typed up the notes for our files. Even though it wasn't part of her job description, Kimberly made the best coffee for us every morning. Kimberly was about 23 or 4, I would guess. She had short blonde hair, deep hazel eyes, a very pretty face, but she was overweight. When you consider that Kimberly was only 5'5", that was a lot of weight for her to carry. Even though she had a beautiful face, her large stomach and rear end immediately destroyed the image. I knew that Kimberly was sensitive about her weight because she always talked about how big she was. I cringed every time she did that, but I understood it was just her way of coping. All I cared about was that Kimberly was really good at her job and a great asset to my team. The fact that Zaba had been acquired came out of nowhere. The 2 Zaba brothers didn't even have the courage to tell the employees in person. They had their lawyer make the announcement. I was upset because all the stock options that the brothers had promised when they went public were now worthless. Aside from that, I didn't know what to make of the change. Carol was just as upset and confused by the news as I was, but she was the one who convinced me to stay until we saw what the new owners would do. They sent a senior vice president to oversee the transition. He started in the main office at first. Zaba had grown from 5 employees when I joined the firm to over 150. From what I heard, the man from the new corporate headquarters would start in the accounting department. Then he would move on to the rest of the company. It wasn't until the second day that I learned that the VP reviewing Zaba security software was none other than Jacob Sanders. However, at the same time, I learned that Jacob was heading up the transition. I also learned that our pay scales would be adjusted to match the parent company. My pay would be raised by a significant amount, and Carol's would also increase. My internal alarm told me to be cautious, but Carol convinced me it would be unwise to leave our current jobs, especially after the pay increases. Besides, she pointed out Jacob would only be there for a short time, and then he would move on. The first change came when 4 new programmers were hired and assigned to the bullpen. Of course, they were all talented individuals, but none of them was as skilled as anyone on my existing team. Not only were they below par in terms of their programming abilities, but they were also arrogant and had a sense of entitlement. The 4 of them immediately started mistreating Kimberly. Sometimes it was bullying, and sometimes it was just plain meanness. I tried to counsel them and point out that their behavior was unacceptable. However, they didn't stop. Instead, they continued harassing Kimberly when they thought I wasn't around. I finally called all four into a conference room and reprimanded them. They pretended to listen, but I could tell they weren't going to change. Aside from their mistreatment of Kimberly, all four of them caused problems. Nobody on my team liked them, and they did more harm than good when it came to their work. I finally decided I wanted them gone. Unfortunately, I didn't have the authority to fire them because Jacob had hired them. I knew that if I demanded their dismissal, Jacob would just ignore me. I knew that Kimberly arrived early each day to make the coffee and get the office ready. Ever since I confronted the four programmers for their treatment of Kimberly, I noticed they all started coming in early too. I eventually figured out that they were using the time before I arrived to torment her. I knew that Kimberly was nearing the point of quitting. I also knew that she liked working at Zaba and needed the job. So I decided to get in early and catch them in the act. Hiding in the supply cabinet just off our little kitchen, I had my cell phone ready. As I expected, Kimberly arrived and began preparing the coffee. Minutes later, the four of them arrived and the tormenting began. "Hey, Butterball Ted," the ringleader smirked at Kimberly, "show us your muscles." Fred, another of the four, added, "I want to see your strength. I'm going to challenge you to an arm wrestling match." Yeah, the other two said, "We'll even help cheer you on." I saw the tears rolling down Kimberly's face, and I couldn't take any more. I had more than enough evidence, so I stepped out of the closet. "You four, pack up your things and leave. You guys are finished here. You don't have the authority to fire us." Fred shot back. "Mr. Sanders hired us, and he said that only he can fire us." "That's true," I said with a determined expression. "However, I've got proof that you mistreated Kimberly. So let me explain your options. You four can either resign immediately, or I will report this to the police. So the ball is in your court. Either quit or face the consequences. I'll give you 15 minutes to decide. You can even go to Jacob if you want, but I'm sure he won't risk his reputation to protect scum like you." 15 minutes later, I had all four resignations, and they were gone. The look on Kimberly's face was one of pure relief and gratitude. "Kimberly," I called her over to my desk after the four were gone. "I apologize for what they put you through. I should have taken action sooner. If anything like this ever happens again, promise me that you'll come to me right away. You're a wonderful person, and those four are just terrible individuals." Kimberly let out a small sob and thanked me for standing up for her. I told her it was part of my job, but I didn't do a good job because she had to suffer at their hands for far too long. "Mr. Arnold, you have no idea how much this means to me," she said as she fought back more tears. "I was going to quit, but I didn't know what I would do without this job. I wasn't sure if I could find another job as good." "Again, Kimberly, I am so sorry that you had to put up with that nonsense. I can see that you're upset. If you'd like to take the rest of the day off, I'll see to it that it isn't charged against your personal days or your sick time." "Thank you, Mr. Arnold, but I'd rather be here at work." After that day, it seemed that Kimberly couldn't do enough for me. I tried to tell her that I was just doing my job, and I continued to make the point that I hadn't done my job very well because of what she had suffered. I got summoned to Jacob's office as soon as he learned that I had forced his programmers to resign. "I want those programmers rehired," he demanded as soon as I stepped into his office. "That's not going to happen," I said forcefully. "I have proof that those four jerks harassed and abused our department's administrative assistant. If you want to hire them back, go ahead. But I can guarantee that there will be a lawsuit against all four of them, the parent company, and you. I don't think your bosses would think too highly of that." Jacob glared at me, but then smiled and caved. He tried to pretend that he didn't know all the details. But I realized that night that he was lying. Carol came home and laced into me for being mean to Jacob. She thought I was a meanie for threatening our boss. I should have known at that point what Jacob was up to, as my gut was screaming danger. But when things at home went back to normal, I dismissed the incident. After all, I still believed that Carol loved me and only me. If I had listened to my gut, I might not be sitting in jail right now. But I was dumb, and I let Jacob and my wife fool me. And for the 2 months of the merger, nothing really changed between Carol and me. I learned that the company that had acquired us was called Unity Software. They were about the same size as us, but had mostly government contracts. Zaba gave them an opportunity in the commercial market. And no, Jacob's dad didn't own the company. His family's fortune was made manufacturing pipe and wiring. However, Jacob's father had sold out the business when Jacob was still in college. I could say many nasty things about Jacob, but I couldn't say he was incompetent. He actually was doing an excellent job combining the two companies. In fact, he had convinced the board to keep the Zaba name because it had a better reputation. What I didn't know was that Jacob had finished his work of combining the two companies in 8 weeks. After that, he had put the seduction of my naive wife in high gear. Just like Sandy in high school, Jacob was able to win over Carol. Despite my warnings about him, Carol seemed enchanted by him and constantly commented on what a great job he was doing. I kept warning her about Jacob, but she just told me I was jealous. By the 4th month of the transition, Carol announced she was pregnant. I was over the moon with happiness. Then our lunches together stopped, and finally Carol stopped riding to work with me. All this culminated with the talk. Carol stopped me one morning before I left for work. I was a little surprised to find her still at home, as she had lately been leaving at least an hour before me. "Michael, we need to talk," she said while motioning for me to take a seat on the couch. I sat down as requested, confused as to what was so important that we had to have a discussion this early in the morning. However, what Carol told me shattered my entire world. "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this," Michael, Carol said with a firmness in her eyes, "but I've fallen in love with Jacob, and he has fallen in love with me." I just stared at her for a long time. I studied her face, and what I realized was that she wasn't sorry about anything. Finally, I exploded. "Are you out of your mind? I told you that Jacob is a jerk, and he would try to drive a wedge between us. I can't believe you're buying into his lies. He's not a jerk." Carol flared. "He's a kind and loving man. He understands me, which is something that you never have." I could feel my heart breaking with each word that Carol said. I was desperate at this point, so I went with something that I hoped would bring her to her senses. Devastated doesn't even begin to describe how I felt. But my father had once counseled me to never show a woman that she had hurt you. Keeping my composure was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I was able to hold it together and smirk at her. "You said that Jacob understands you like I never have," I said with a tight laugh. "You're right, he does. He understands that you're a naive, gullible person. God, you are so gullible, but you know what? You deserve each other. He's a jerk, and you're a meanie. Forget you, Michael." Carol stormed. "No, that's never going to happen again," I said calmly. "But just so you know, I'm not moving out of this house. You can go live with Jacob in his apartment." What a nightmare I had fallen into. Learning that my loving wife had been involved with Jacob all this time was too much to process. I wanted to shout at Carol, but I just didn't have it in me to confront her. Jacob, on the other hand, I had no reservations about. I cried all the way to work, but finally got myself under some sort of control. Well, that's an out-and-out lie. I was running on pure rage. On the way over, I had decided that I would resign and confront Jacob, but not necessarily in that order. I ran into Jacob as he was entering the company's front door. He didn't seem at all alarmed to see me and even flashed a smirk at me. A thought sprang up in my mind that it would be so like Carol to take it upon herself to drop her little bomb on me without consulting Jacob. She was very independent. Jacob, on the other hand, I suspected, had no intention of telling me about the baby until after it was born. Then he would take both my wife and newly born child away at the same time. It would be his ultimate win over me. Anger filled me as I walked up to him. He just continued smirking. At that moment, I exploded and punched him in the nose and then in his mouth. Blood immediately began to pour down his face, but I wasn't done. I hit him 2 hard shots to his groin, and as he began to crumble, I hit him with an uppercut. I left him curled up in front of the door as the guards raced to help. Later, I would learn he lost 3 teeth in addition to a broken nose. He also had an injury to his groin. I didn't come out completely unscathed, as I had broken 2 fingers on my left hand. I headed to the office area and started boxing up all my personal possessions and papers. Kimberly saw me, and I could see concern and fear on her face. "What's happened?" she asked with genuine concern. "Jacob has been involved with my wife behind my back, and now she is leaving me for him. I just confronted him physically, so I guess I'm terminated. And even if they don't fire me, I quit." The rest of my team was shocked to hear what had transpired. They were not only upset for me, but were also very worried about their own individual jobs. I assured them that what I did would have no effect on their continued employment. Once the staff was calmed and assured that they wouldn't suffer for my stupidity, I went back to packing up my stuff. But I never finished as the police arrived, and I was arrested. I expected that that would be my fate, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon. As they handcuffed me, I asked Kimberly if she would gather up the rest of my stuff and take it home with her. After I had my photo taken, was fingerprinted, and given paper towels to clean my fingers, I was allowed to make my phone call. But I didn't know who to call. My parents were away on a cruise. They also lived 2,000 miles away in San Diego while I lived in Nashville. I certainly wasn't going to call Carol. Finally, I decided to call Kimberly. Maybe she could find me a lawyer? However, when I called Zaba, the receptionist told me that Kimberly had left for the day. After that, I didn't know what to do, so I just sat in my cell, alternating between being angry as heck and wondering how I could win my wife back. One thought kept raging in my head. How could Carol betray me in such a cold and heartless way? Then the thought of getting revenge clouded out everything else. As the day wore on and I languished in jail, I began to realize that Jacob already had a plan in place. My troubles were just beginning. I know that Jacob wasn't expecting the attack that he got today. However, I was convinced that Jacob expected me to confront him once I discovered his treachery. Only he figured that he could do it at his own time in place of choosing. I guess I ruined that part of his plan. About 4 that afternoon, I was brought before a judge to be arraigned. I had been assigned a public defender since I didn't have an attorney. To my horror, he looked like a teenager with a bad complexion. Not only did my attorney look like a kid, but he didn't seem to know anything about me or my case. He was quickly trying to read through the file when the judge got annoyed with him. "Counselor," the judge barked, "it's really simple. Does your client plead guilty or not guilty?" The kid glanced over at me like a deer staring into the headlights. So, I jumped in and announced firmly, "Not guilty." Thank goodness, the judge sighed. Bail is set at $2,500 cash or check. I didn't have nearly enough cash on me, and I didn't carry blank checks with me. So I looked up at the judge. "Excuse me, Your Honor, but I don't have that much cash, and I don't carry blank checks with me. Is there some way I could contact a bail bondsman? My clerk will help you with that, and she'll let you know when your court date will be," he said. But before he could call the next case, I heard a voice from behind me. "I'll pay for his bail." I spun around and found Kimberly waving her checkbook. I was surprised to see her in the courtroom and touched that she cared enough to come and help me. "I'll repay you as soon as I can get to an ATM," I assured Kimberly. "I'm not worried about that," she said softly as she looked at my swollen hand. "Does it hurt a lot? In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't even register compared to the pain of Carol's betrayal. For what it's worth, boss." Kimberly said, looking up into my eyes, "I think your wife made a very foolish mistake. She's chosen Jacob over you." I smiled at my administrative assistant. "Thanks, that's very kind of you to say." At that point, a young man stepped in front of me. "Are you Michael Arnold?" When I said yes, he handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised, but the speed at which the papers had been served upon me left no doubt that Jacob and Carol had been planning this for some time. It was just another blow to my heart. "Let's get something to eat after I get some cash out of the ATM," I said discouragedly. However, when I tried to access my account, I was denied. I called the bank and was told there was a freeze on all of my accounts. This would remain in effect until the court lifted it. Yes, I know now that you can appeal to the court for relief from having your assets totally frozen. But I didn't know it back then. I also found out that my other savings account had been frozen and my credit cards had been canceled. A quick check of my wallet showed that I had $126 plus a $100 bill tucked in one of the creases. Apparently, Carol and Jacob have frozen all of my money, I informed Kimberly. "I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but at least I can treat you to dinner." "No, you're not," Kimberly protested. "You're coming to my apartment and I'll cook dinner for us." I had to admit that Kimberly's suggestion appealed to me. It didn't make sense for me to spend what little cash I had on dining out. We stopped by Zaba and picked up my car, and I followed Kimberly to her apartment. I couldn't believe how helpful this woman was to me. I mean, she was just a fellow colleague. I was so going to repay her every cent and much more as soon as I could sort my finances out. Over dinner, I was really feeling down. Not only that, but my 2 fingers hurt like crazy. I had put ice on them as soon as I got to Kimberly's place, but they still hurt. After watching me wince in pain, Kimberly finally pulled out a bottle of pain relievers that she had gotten for a dental procedure. I took one of those, and after a half hour, the pain faded considerably. Still, I was not in a good mood. They really did a number on me, I complained. I am completely screwed. I can't even think about getting any revenge against Jacob or Carol right now because it would totally backfire on me. But someday I'm going to teach those two a lesson. Mr. Arnold, Kimberly said in a soft voice. Please call me Michael, I insisted. I'm not your boss anymore. Besides, what you've done for me today makes you a very good friend. Kimberly smiled and continued. Michael, my mother cheated on my father and left him for someone else. I had to go live with her, and I hated every minute of it. Her partner was a terrible person, just like Jacob. He never married my mother, but they lived together for 10 years before he found someone younger to run off with. My father was bitter and tried to get back at my mother for years. He ended up in trouble with the law several times and finally died a broken man. Don't waste your life seeking revenge. In the end, my dad told me that he truly regretted letting my mother's betrayal ruin him. He wished he had just moved on and forgotten about her. Today, my mother lives alone in an assisted living facility where she struggles with health issues from years of smoking. I visit her once a week even though I still don't like her very much. And every week, I have to listen to her lament over the mistakes she made leaving my father. So please don't waste your life seeking revenge. I told her that she was probably right. Still, at that moment, I had no intention of letting those backstabbing individuals off the hook. The anger was still bubbling just below the surface, and I wanted to make them pay. After helping clean up the dishes, I told Kimberly that I should get going and find an inexpensive motel. Her response was immediate. No, you're not doing that. You'll spend the night here. I have a spare bedroom, and you're welcome to it, Kimberly. You have been the only positive thing in my life right now. I can't impose on you anymore. First of all, it isn't an imposition, she insisted. Second, if you sleep here, I can go to work tomorrow and find out what's going on. Again, Kimberly was making a lot more sense than me, so I accepted her invitation. Around mid-morning the following day, Kimberly called me to let me know that I had, indeed, been let go from my job. She then told me to use her computer and type up a letter instructing HR to send my final paycheck to her address. Shirley, the head of human resources, wasn't sure whether the company was obligated to pay my vacation time and sick leave. But she felt that should be included in the letter anyway. But the courts have frozen all my money, I pointed out. Shirley told me that the court's order is only for the bank accounts. So submit the letter as quickly as possible before Jacob or Carol catch on. I followed Kimberly's advice and got a fax back stating that I would be receiving a check for $4,925.57 in a couple of days. The fax also mentioned that they would have to check state law to determine if the company had to pay vacation time or sick pay. As it turned out, they didn't. Still, getting almost $5,000 was a big relief. When Kimberly got home, she informed me that Jacob hadn't been in that day, but Carol had been, and she was furious with me for ruining her boyfriend's life. Somehow, that amused both Kimberly and me. I decided to stay at Kimberly's place until I received my check. During that time, I put together a resume and began actively searching for a job. I quickly discovered that Jacob and Carol had tarnished my reputation. Since I worked in cybersecurity, no one wanted to take a chance on me with a pending legal case. When my check arrived, I signed it over to Kimberly, and she deposited it into her account. I didn't want to risk opening a new account only to have it frozen as well. Once again, when I mentioned that I would move out and find my own apartment, Kimberly was upset. Kimberly pointed out that I probably wouldn't even be able to rent a place without a checking account. Plus, if they checked my credit at the moment, it would likely show my financial difficulties. Please just stay here until you find a new job, she urged. In the meantime, you can find a lawyer. I eventually agreed. The lawyer I hired took me on after I provided him with a $2,000 down payment. However, it was money well spent because he immediately asked the court to allow me access to a reasonable amount of funds from our checking and savings accounts. The court permitted me to spend a sufficient amount to provide a basic lifestyle. This, of course, included paying my lawyer. I had been at Kimberly's apartment for 8 days now and thought it was time for me to leave. So I found an apartment in her complex and put down the necessary deposit. That Saturday, Kimberly helped me buy the minimum furnishings for my new place. I also took her out to dinner as promised. Kimberly suggested going to the Olive Garden, which I also liked. During the meal, I studied her more closely. She had the face of an angel, but the extra weight she carried detracted from her beauty. And I could tell that Kimberly was very self-conscious about her weight. Then I had an idea that I hoped she wouldn't find insulting. I thought about it carefully deciding how best to present my suggestion. "I just found out that our complex has a gym," I said casually. "I'd like to use it, but I'd really like to have a workout partner. Would you be interested? You really want to be seen with me?" she asked as she gestured towards her body, indicating her excess weight. "Yeah, I would," I said eagerly, "unless you'd rather not be seen with someone with a pending criminal case." My comment had the exact reaction that I wanted. Kimberly didn't want to go to the gym because she was concerned about people seeing her physique. However, Kimberly also didn't want to offend me. So, she agreed. We established a routine of going to the gym 4 times a week at 6 in the morning when there was usually no one present. After the first week, Kimberly realized she didn't have to worry about embarrassment and started to enjoy our gym sessions. I continued to search for work, but no one in the security software industry was interested in hiring me until my case was resolved. And in talking to my lawyer, I learned that there was a good chance I would be found guilty of assault. Yet, he was cautious. He never told me what to say or to lie. However, he did mention that if my anger was a result of my boss and wife's betrayal, that could be a mitigating factor. And if I couldn't recall exactly what happened, it would certainly be considered by the court. On the day of my trial, Kimberly took off from work and came with me. I really appreciated the support. When my lawyer learned that Judge Parker would be the presiding judge, he convinced me to request a bench trial. That's where the judge rather than a jury makes the decision. My attorney explained that it would make the judge happy, and besides, Judge Parker hated cheaters. The prosecutor presented 3 witnesses to the alleged assault. They told what they had seen and heard. My attorney cross-examined them, getting them all to admit that they hadn't seen the beginning of the fight, nor did they hear me threaten Jacob. They couldn't even state categorically that Mr. Sanders hadn't thrown the first punch. Then Jacob was called to the stand where he told his story. Naturally, Jacob went into great detail about what was called the unprovoked attack. Jacob was emphatic that he hadn't even thrown 1 punch and then listed the injuries he had sustained. My attorney questioned him about his relationship with my wife. Jacob lied and said they were just friends. When asked about the child my wife was carrying, he told the judge that it was mine as far as he knew. When Jacob got down from the stand, he smirked at me as he returned to his seat. I was the only witness my attorney called for my defense, and all he did was ask me to describe what had happened the day that led to the alleged assault and what I remembered of the incident. So I explained how my wife had blindsided me that morning, telling me that she was divorcing me to marry my boss. I was especially devastated when my wife told me the child I thought was mine was, in reality, Jacob's. I explained that she had been the love of my life, but she had discarded me like a pair of old shoes. I told the judge that I remembered seeing Jacob by the door and him smirking at me. After that, I lied and said I didn't remember anything until I was at my desk throwing things into a box. The prosecutor tried to trip me up about my recollections. He kept trying to go over the timeline. The truth was that I was in such a rage that morning that I had no idea about time. And the more he questioned me and tried to get me to commit to specific times and actions, the more it became obvious that I had no idea. Then he asked me if I really thought the court would believe that I, conveniently, didn't remember anything about the assault. I told him that I had a pounding headache on my way to work and saw flashes of light, which actually was true. I reiterated that all I remembered was Jacob smirking at me. Then he asked me if I knew for a fact that the child my wife was carrying was Jacob's. I responded that all I could tell him was what my wife had said. Carol was not in court as no one had bothered to subpoena her. My attorney told me that he felt my wife would be a wild card he didn't want to touch. I assumed the prosecutor felt the same. After I stepped down, the judge retired to his chambers to consider his verdict, but was back in 10 minutes. "It's clear to me," Judge Parker said, "that Mr. Arnold was betrayed in a most cowardly and shameful manner. I believe that this shock to his nervous system rendered him badly impaired mentally. I believe Mr. Arnold was temporarily insane, and therefore I find him not guilty. That's outrageous." Jacob roared from his seat, which brought Judge Parker's gavel down hard with a threat to have Jacob held in contempt. The sight of Jacob red-faced with anger pleased me. Jacob's victory over me had just taken a small hit. Still, I wanted revenge against him so badly. However, having just escaped a jail term, I would have to put any thoughts of revenge on hold for the foreseeable future. Besides, I had no idea how to strike back at either of them. Outside the courtroom, Jacob was waiting for me. I toyed with the idea of trying to provoke him into attacking me, but I wasn't sure how that would turn out, so I simply called a bailiff over. I'm not supposed to be within 500 feet of this man, but he is preventing me from leaving." The bailiff looked at Jacob and told him to move along. Jacob yelled back over his shoulder, "This isn't over. I'm going to sue you." That sort of concerned me, so I asked my lawyer, "Can he sue me? Anyone can sue anyone else," he said with a smile. "But his case is weak. But if you really want to undercut him, admit nothing but offer to pay his medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance." So that's what I did in a letter addressed to his office. Jacob never responded, and he never filed suit. The following night after my trial, it was now a little over 9 weeks since Carol had dropped the bombshell on me. While I was still filled with anger, the win in court had lifted my spirits slightly, so I decided to take Kimberly out for dinner. I also had some exciting news I wanted to share with her. At this point, let me clarify for readers who think my story will follow the usual script. I've read many similar stories about betrayed husbands. In those stories, the injured husbands all start their own businesses. Then the cheated on husband becomes very successful, and his former wife realizes she made a huge mistake. That was never going to happen to me. I am just an employee. I'm a good employee, but just an employee. Kimberly and I had agreed to meet at a small Italian restaurant. She had to work a little later that night because all wasn't well in my former department. It wasn't anything serious, they were simply adjusting to my absence. Anyway, when she came in, she looked wonderful. Kimberly was still on the heavier side, but it was obvious that she had lost weight, and the dress she wore was very flattering. I stood up and hugged her. "Wow, you look fabulous. You've lost weight, haven't you?" Kimberly smiled. "Yes, I've lost 16 pounds. I'm sorry I didn't notice before now, but you usually wear oversized sweatshirts and sweatpants. Anyway, like I said, you look fabulous." The restaurant was small. It was exactly the kind of place that couples would choose for a date. But I didn't think of this as a date. It was just a meeting between two close friends. "I asked you to have dinner with me tonight because I wanted to celebrate winning in court, and I have some news. I found a job." "That's fantastic," Kimberly beamed. "Who are you going to work for?" "Sable Security out of Jacksonville, Florida," I replied. "I didn't know they had an office here," Kimberly said with concern. "They don't. I'm going to have to relocate to Jacksonville." I was surprised when the light went out in Kimberly's eyes, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I thought you'd be happy for me," I said, confused. "I am happy that you found a job," Kimberly said as the tears continued to flow, "but you're going to be 600 miles away. Kimberly, do you remember when you told me not to let my wife's betrayal consume me with hatred?" She nodded. "I now understand that the only way I can do that is to put some distance between Carol and me and let time heal. I need a fresh start." "I understand," Kimberly said as she dabbed her eyes. "It's just that I'm going to miss you. I have really enjoyed having a friend." "Hey, I'm only a phone call away," I said, trying to cheer her up with no success. I was truly taken aback by Kimberly's reaction. Then it struck me that she probably didn't have many friends, so I offered another suggestion. "You could come down and visit if you like. I don't know what Jacksonville has to offer, but I'll find out." "You'd really like me to come to visit?" she questioned. "Of course," I said quickly. "Remember, I won't have any friends down there either. When are you leaving?" Kimberly finally asked. "I don't start for another 45 days, but I've got a lot to get done before then. I need to find a place to live, open a new account in a bank there. I also have to go for a polygraph test, get fingerprinted, and take a drug test. I figure it's going to take at least 2 trips down there to get it all done." The mood lightened somewhat after that, but I noticed that Kimberly didn't eat very much. I figured she was still a little upset. In fact, the closer it got to the time I was supposed to leave, I found Kimberly getting a little sadder each day. It seemed that she was hoping for something more between us. I have to confess that this confused me because I felt Kimberly deserved someone better than me. I spent my last night before heading to my new job in Kimberly's apartment. She made a delicious dinner topped off with a chocolate cake with the message, "I'll miss you" on top. After I helped her clean up, we watched television until it was time for bed. I gave her a peck on her cheek before heading into the guest room. Sometime during the night, I felt the bed shift slightly and a body slid in next to me. I was still half asleep when I realized it was Kimberly, and she was snuggling up to me. I froze for a second as she reached out to hold my hand. But by then, my heart rate had already increased. She held my hand for a few minutes until she fell back asleep. It was a sweet gesture, and it made me feel closer to Kimberly. But I knew that our relationship could never be more than good friends. We both fell back asleep, finding comfort in each other's presence without crossing any boundaries. And so, in the end, our story was one of friendship and support during difficult times, rather than a tale of romance. As I left for Jacksonville, we promised to stay in touch, recognizing the value of our bond. When I was tired, I cuddled next to Kimberly, and she was crying. I was worried that maybe I had upset her or she was mad that I had taken advantage of her or something. "What's wrong, Kimberly?" I asked in almost a panic. "Did I upset you?" "No, I'm just so happy," Kimberly said as she put her head on my chest. "I've been with 5 or 6 guys before, but this is the first time I've ever felt love." "Thank you." She took 2 steps toward the door and then came back to me. She leaned down and hugged me. "Will you sleep with me tonight?" I was more than happy to oblige, if for no other reason than my bed was wet. Besides, being in bed with Kimberly seemed like a wonderful way to spend my last night in the city. As my car pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Kimberly sit down on the curb. She buried her head in her hands and cried. I desperately didn't want to leave her, but I knew this was for the best. I was still in love with Carol, and therefore I was emotionally hurt. It was somewhat funny though, because I no longer thought about revenge. I just had a deep sadness in my heart. Jacksonville was an exciting city, but I didn't get to see much of it. I jumped into my new job with both feet. I worked long hours, not just to get caught up, but because it helped me forget about Carol. I kept in touch with Kimberly, and she always seemed so thrilled to hear from me and so sad when our phone call would end. It was from her that I heard the news that I dreaded. Carol and Jacob were married about a month after the divorce was final. I also learned that Carol had a baby girl. For whatever reason, that news didn't bother me as much. Maybe I was beginning to get over the hurt and humiliation. It was true that I seldom had any sleepless nights anymore. I also rarely woke up in the morning feeling down that Carol wasn't in bed beside me. Kimberly came down and spent 4 days with me in March. Since we hadn't seen each other for some time, we were unsure about our relationship. About a year after that, I was told that I could hire an administrative assistant for my team. Sable Security was considerably larger than my old company. Whereas Zaba had 1 team that worked on cybersecurity issues, we had 6. And in that year, I had advanced from just being part of 1 team to heading it. As the decision was mine as to who to hire, I immediately called Kimberly. I had barely explained the job to her when she said that she wanted it. When I picked Kimberly up at the airport, she took my breath away. As I had predicted, she was gorgeous. I saw people's heads turn as she came out of the passenger area, but all she wanted to do was to get to me. She threw herself into my arms and hugged me. That made me weak in the knees. The plan was for Kimberly to stay with me until she found an apartment of her own. I figured that would only take about a week, but the search stretched out week after week. Each apartment she looked at had something wrong with it. I wasn't complaining because Kimberly and I were sharing the same bed. It's funny that over the year and a half that I'd been in Jacksonville, I had continued to think about Carol less and less. And when Kimberly arrived, I stopped thinking about her at all. Still, I knew that Kimberly would eventually move out, and I was dreading that day. After 5 weeks, I asked Kimberly about her apartment situation, and she started to cry. I was totally surprised. I knew that I had made her cry, but for the life of me, I didn't know why. "I'm sorry," I apologized. "Did I say something wrong? Do you want me to leave?" Kimberly asked timidly. "Hell, no," I said forcefully. "I'd love for you to stay permanently, but I know that one day you're going to want to leave. I just want some time to prepare. I'd ask you to marry me, but you are way too good for me." "No, I'm not," Kimberly protested. "I've loved you almost from the day I started working at Zaba. I'd marry you in a heartbeat. That changed everything for us." We went shopping for a ring that day and began planning our wedding. Even though I was terrified that Kimberly would eventually break up with me for someone else, I was so in love with her that I had to take the chance. 6 months later, Kimberly and I were married. A year after that, Kimberly gave birth to a little boy we call Mikey Jr. 18 months after that, we had a little girl named Charlotte. I had now risen in Sable to where I supervised all 8 cybersecurity teams. Yes, we had added 2 more. Kimberly, on the other hand, had chosen to be a stay-at-home mom. It was close to Christmas, 3 years later, when I was called into a meeting. It was at this meeting that I learned that Sable was planning to acquire Zaba Security Software. I was to be part of a team that would conduct the due diligence before the acquisition could be finalized. During the years that Kimberly and I had been married, Kimberly's mother had died, but my parents retired. They had moved to Jacksonville to be nearer to the grandchildren and me. With them as babysitters, I made plans to use the week-long getaway as a mini vacation. I would also use Kimberly's skills as an administrative assistant to help me do my investigation. That way, I could take Kimberly to work with me every day where she could see some of the people she had worked with, and we'd be able to spend quality time together. As the week in Nashville went on, I learned 4 things. First, I learned that this facility was the only location where Zaba did its cybersecurity work. Second, Jacob had been installed as the chief operating officer, and Carol was a senior project manager. Third, that despite my previous issues with Jacob, I found that he ran a tight ship. I found that his entire operation, from my standpoint, was first-rate. And the last thing I learned was that Zaba was having their Christmas party that Friday night, and I was expected to go. Outside of the initial introductions of our team to Jacob, I had no contact with him. Also, I never saw Carol during the entire week. However, that changed at the Christmas party. Zaba had rented a ballroom in the Hilton DoubleTree in downtown Nashville. It was beautifully decorated with tables surrounding the dance floor, and a 5-member band had set up in one of the corners. They softly played Christmas carols, gentle background music, and occasionally mixed in oldies. There was to be dancing after the dinner and speeches. Also, there was an open bar to everyone's delight, and it was gaining increased attention as more and more people arrived. Jacob, Carol, and some of the senior officers from Zaba made a point of greeting the Sable team. I had not been looking forward to this. I didn't know how I would react to having to face Jacob and Carol together. However, my fears were for nothing. Jacob, as I already knew, looked about the same, and Carol, while looking a little older, still looked good. Strangely, I felt nothing when they came to greet us. "Mike, I'm glad you could join us tonight," Jacob said nervously. "I hope our past differences won't interfere with the acquisition?" "Not from me," I assured him. "That's ancient history. And who is this lovely person?" Jacob smiled widely as he took Kimberly's hand. "This is my lovely wife, Kimberly," I said as I hugged her. Jacob's smile faded as he looked at Kimberly and then me. Kimberly smirked at Jacob. "Don't you remember me, Jacob? I was Michael's administrative assistant when he worked for Zaba. But I upgraded to become Michael's wife. It was a huge promotion for me." Jacob's eyes narrowed further, but he tried to put the smile back on. However, it didn't seem genuine. "Of course, it's been so long. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you." Jacob moved on, but his eyes continued to wander back to Kimberly and me. Carol then slid up next to me. "Michael, you're looking really good," she said as she took my hand. "And your wife is gorgeous. I didn't know you had gotten married. We'll be married 7 years in March," Kimberly said with a smile as she hugged my arm. "Both you and Jacob are looking well," I replied, and then asked, "How is your daughter doing?" Carol cringed at first, but then smiled. "She's doing great. Tammy is in the 2nd grade, and her brother, Jacob Jr., is in kindergarten. Do you guys have any children?" "2," Kimberly answered. "Mickey Jr. is in kindergarten, and Charlotte is still at home with me. They're both doing well." "Thank you for asking." Carol moved on after that, and shortly after that, Kimberly and I drifted away to find our table. The meal was excellent, and the speeches were, thankfully, short. The CEO of Sable simply assured everyone that nobody's job was in jeopardy for at least the next year, and that he looked forward to the merger. When the dinner was done, the music started in earnest, and Kimberly and I took several spins around the floor. I think the young kids of today have really missed the mark when it comes to dancing. Slow dancing with someone you love is such a beautiful thing. It can connect 2 people almost as much as sharing a special moment. Sometime during the evening, I felt a tap on my shoulder. When I turned, I found Carol standing there. Kimberly turned to see what I was looking at, and her eyes narrowed when she realized it was my ex-wife. Carol smiled sweetly at Kimberly. "Could I borrow your husband for a dance?" Kimberly looked at me and then smiled at Carol. "Just as long as you remember where to bring him back to." I guided Carol out onto the dance floor, and we danced in silence for about a minute. "Michael, I just want to apologize to you for what Jacob and I did to you back then," she said with true remorse in her voice. "You didn't deserve any of it. But when I discovered that I was pregnant with Jacob's child, I knew we were through. I decided to make our break quick and simple. I never even considered how much it would hurt you. I shouldn't have allowed Jacob to talk me into the scorched earth policy we used. That was totally uncalled for." I chuckled a little. As people say, it's either water under the bridge or water over the dam. It doesn't matter now. We've all moved on. Besides, I sort of did deserve some of it. I did beat Jacob up pretty badly. Apparently, I didn't damage his pride too badly because you've had a 2nd kid. Carol giggled at that. We danced for a bit in silence, and I decided to bury the hatchet between us once and for all. Look, Carol, I began hesitantly. I admit, I was very bitter when you left me for Jacob. It did take many months to accept losing you, but now we're both happily married with kids. I've come to believe that this was what was meant to happen. Carol chalked out a harsh laugh, and when I looked at her face, a tear was running down her cheek. Did I say something wrong? Carol just shook her head. No, Michael, you didn't say anything wrong. It's just that it isn't what you think. On the surface, everyone thinks we're the perfect couple. And for the first year, I would have agreed with them. But Jacob is just a charming manipulator. He uses people and then discards them. I know that he's cheated on me many times, but he isn't as smart as he thinks he is. Every time I find out he's cheated on me, I do the same. My mouth dropped open and Carol noticed. She chuckled. It's a hell of a way to live. I know, she said sadly. I should have left Jacob when I found out what he was really like, but I was too ashamed and too proud. Michael, I am pleased that you found happiness, but I will always regret that I tossed you away. You and my children are the best things that ever happened to me. We continued to talk until the song ended. Then Carol accompanied me back to my table and thanked Kimberly for letting her borrow me. As Kimberly and I were dancing our last dance of the night, it struck me that her advice all those years ago had been spot on. If I had refused to move on from Carol, it might very well have consumed me. I guess it's true what they say, when God closes a door, he opens another one. When I lost Carol, I was totally devastated, but then God let me find Kimberly, and I can't even imagine a life without her. So what did you and Carol talk about? Kimberly finally asked. Is she trying to get you back? I laughed and hugged her, like she has any chance of doing that. Good, Kimberly said as she put her head on my shoulder. Just remember that I'm a jealous one-man sort of woman. I'll cut your ear off if you ever try to leave me. I only bring it up because I heard that their marriage isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Carol told me the same. I agreed, but I think they'll stay together for the children. After the kids are grown, I wouldn't put any bets on that marriage surviving. What a sad way to live your life. Anyway, Carol did tell me something that I found amusing. I know that she was not at all amused by it, and I'm pretty sure that Jacob isn't going to find it amusing when they get home tonight. What's that? Carol was standing behind her husband, and he didn't realize she was there. Jacob was staring at you when he said that flipping Michael won again.